In the next 10 minutes you will learn about health behavior change in a step-by-step manner, and you will be made familiar with the 5 principles of the theory. The Health Action Process Approach, HAPA, is a health behavior change framework with an open architecture. It is supposed to predict individual changes in health behaviors, such as quitting smoking, improving physical activity, dental hygiene, seatbelt use, or dietary behaviors. I will first show the entire model briefly before explaining it step by step. It only looks complicated, but it is easy, as you will see in a moment. The arrows go from left to right, reflecting the course of deliberation and action that an individual needs to refrain from risk behaviors and to adopt and maintain health behaviors. I will guide you step by step through the assumptions and principles that constitute the model. It is commonplace that behavior change first requires a behavioral intention. Many people lead a health-compromising life. A first step to overcome this situation may be professional risk communication, for example in the context of patient education. This can be effective if it happens in a teachable moment. After an intention to change one's risk behaviors has been developed, there is no guarantee that action will be taken. There are roadblocks on the way from intention to the eventual performance of the intended health-enhancing behaviors. I will come back to this in a moment. First, let's attend to the question how an intention can be developed. There are quite a few antecedents of intention formation. Intentions can be predicted by several psychological constructs. In this diagram, this is illustrated by 3 generic predictors. For example, self-efficacy, outcome expectancies, and risk perception are suitable predictors of intention formation, among others. However, when predicting behavior change, such as improved physical exercise, it is not sufficient to rely on the intention. There is a long way from forming an intention to taking action. Moreover, people enter a different psychological state after they have decided to change their behavior. This switch of mindsets is reflected by the terms motivation and volition. When forming an intention, people are in the motivation phase. Afterwards, they reside in the volition phase. We need tools that assist with the translation of intentions into actions. There are a host of variables that operate in particular in this volition phase. We have found 2 volitional constructs very useful when it comes to predict health behavior change, namely coping self-efficacy and planning. By including the 2 volitional constructs, we account for more behavioral variance. This is somewhat trivial, since additional constructs allow for more variance to be explained. The main focus of the HAPA framework is not to account for more and more behavior variance by adding more and more predictors. Rather, its main focus lies in understanding the mechanisms of health behavior change. As you will see in a moment, the mediating role of the volitional factors is an important feature of the model. Now I will explain the 5 principles. The first principle says that we should divide the health behavior change process into 2 phases. There is a switch of mindsets when people go through the course of deliberation and action. First comes the motivation phase, where people develop their intentions. Afterwards, they enter the volition phase. But it might not be sufficient to distinguish between motivation and volition only. Principle 2 says, in the volition phase there are 2 groups of individuals, those who have not yet translated their intentions into action, and those who have. There are inactive as well as active persons in this phase. In other words, in the volitional phase we find intenders and actors who are characterized by different psychological states. Thus, in addition to health behavior change as a continuous process, we can also create three categories of people with different mindsets depending on their current point of residence within the course of health behavior change. HAPA has two layers, a continuum layer and a stage layer. Depending on the research question, one might choose the one or the other. When people do hold an intention but they still fail to act, they are in the volitional pre-actional stage. This represents a great challenge for psychological research and interventions. People who are motivated but don't act often only need the right skills to translate their intention into action. Principle 3 says, planning is a key strategy at this point. Planning serves as a mediator between intentions and behavior. However, planning is not simply what is referred to in everyday language. Planning is an umbrella term for more refined psychological constructs. Principle 4 says, planning can be divided into action planning and coping planning. Action planning pertains to the when, where, and how of intended action. In contrast, coping planning includes the anticipation of barriers and the design of alternative actions that help to attain one's goals in spite of the impediments. There are more mediators. Principle 5 says, perceived self-efficacy is required throughout the entire process, however it differs from phase to phase. This is because there are different challenges as people progress from one stage to the next one. Goal setting, planning, initiative, action and maintenance pose challenges that are not of the same nature. Therefore, we distinguish between action self-efficacy, coping self-efficacy and recovery self-efficacy. Some authors prefer the term task self-efficacy instead of action self-efficacy, and maintenance self-efficacy instead of coping and recovery self-efficacy. Whatever the preferred term is, important is the feature of phase-specific self-efficacies. Finally, I want to summarize the theory with two slides. The first one refers to the continuum layer and the second one to the stage layer of HAPA. HAPA is designed as a sequence of two continuous self-regulatory processes, a goal-setting phase and a goal pursuit phase. The second phase is subdivided into a pre-action and an action phase. One can superimpose these three phases on the continuum model as a second layer and regard them as a moderator. This two-layer architecture allows to switch between the continuum model and the stage model depending on the given research question. The stage layer is useful when designing stage-matched interventions. For non-intenders, one needs, among others, to address the pros and cons of the critical behavior. This is called here risk and resource communication. For intenders, planning treatments are helpful to support people who lack the necessary skills to translate their intentions into behavior. And for actors, one needs to stabilize their newly adopted health behaviors by relapse prevention strategies.